Hello everybody, I am Evelyn and I will tell you one story of a good viewing. Dr. Evelyn Hayes had always been drawn to the mysteries of the Earth's interior. Her career as a seismologist had brought her to places most people would never consider: deep underground caves, volcanoes on the verge of eruption, and abandoned mines. She had always believed the Earth held secrets waiting to be uncovered. But nothing had prepared her for what she was about to encounter. It began as a routine research trip. Dr. Hayes and her team had been assigned to monitor unusual seismic activity originating from a remote part of the Pacific Ocean. The signals were faint at first, hardly noticeable against the usual background hum of tectonic plates shifting. But over time, they began to grow more pronounced. These signals were unlike anything Dr. Hayes had seen before. The signals seemed to originate from deep within the Earth's mantle, far below the surface where no natural source of seismic waves should exist. As the weeks went by, the signals grew more erratic, long, drawn-out pulses interspersed with sharp, high-frequency bursts that made her stomach churn every time they blared through the equipment. Something was wrong. The team was concerned, but their mission was clear: investigate, gather data, and report back. They set up their research station on a small, uninhabited island that sat atop the tectonic zone where the signals were most intense. The island was little more than a rock outcrop isolated from civilization, surrounded by treacherous cliffs and crashing waves. It felt like the perfect place to vanish. The first night on the island was uneventful. The air was thick with the scent of saltwater and damp earth, and the sounds of the ocean were muffled by the dense fog that seemed to linger over the place like a shroud. The team set up their camp, positioning seismic detectors and communication equipment in a makeshift hut. The signal still pulsed through their machines, louder now, almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat coming from the bowels of the planet. The following morning, the crew began their first full day of investigation. Dr. Hayes, along with her lead technician, Jacob, and two research assistants, Monica and Ethan, set off toward a nearby cave system. It was an ancient formation, long forgotten by most, though the locals whispered of strange occurrences in the area, tales of men who had ventured into the caves only to return months later, forever changed, speaking in fragmented words, their eyes wide with terror. As the team descended into the cave, Dr. Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The air grew colder with every step they took, and the walls of the cave seemed to close in around them. The rock underfoot was slick, and every breath she took echoed in the silence, unnervingly loud in the tight spaces. Jacob was the first to notice it. "Evelyn, look at this," he said, pointing to a wall of the cave. There, etched into the stone, was an odd symbol, a jagged line that spiraled inward, surrounded by runic markings that seemed to pulse faintly. Dr. Hayes stepped closer, her fingers tracing the cold surface of the stone. The symbol was unsettling, unlike anything she had seen before. The markings looked older than anything she had ever encountered. As she touched it, the ground trembled beneath her feet. It was brief, a subtle shift, but enough to make her heart race. She turned to Jacob, but before she could speak, a sudden sharp crack echoed from deeper within the cave. "Did you hear that?" Monica whispered, her voice tight with fear. They all froze. The sound came again, a faint, distant echo that sounded like the grinding of stone against stone. Then another sound, closer this time, like a low, guttural growl, followed by the unmistakable sound of something scraping against rock. Dr. Hayes motioned for everyone to stay still. They were too far from the entrance now to make a quick retreat, and whatever was down there, whatever had made those sounds, was moving closer. The light from their torches flickered, casting eerie shadows against the walls. Dr. Hayes felt her pulse quicken as a cold sweat dripped down her back. She could hear the sound of her own breathing, ragged and panicked, and the faint echo of something else, something more, something alive. "Monica, Ethan, stay close," Dr. Hayes ordered, her voice low. "Jacob, get back to the equipment and call for backup." But before Jacob could move, the ground beneath them shifted again. This time, the tremor was stronger. The cave seemed to groan, as if it were alive, and the air thickened with an oppressive energy. Dr. Hayes stumbled, reaching out for support, but there was nothing to grab onto. The walls of the cave were moving, closing in on them. Panic gripped her chest as she realized something was wrong, unnaturally wrong. In a blur of motion, the walls shifted again, this time with a deafening crack. Rocks tumbled down from above, narrowly missing them as the tunnel began to collapse. "Run!" Dr. Hayes screamed. They bolted toward the entrance, but the cave was no longer the same. What had been a clear path to safety was now a labyrinth of crumbling tunnels. The walls seemed to twist, rearranging themselves as if the cave itself were alive, conscious. Each turn they took led them deeper into the darkness, and the growling sounds followed them, closer now, louder. Finally, they emerged into a larger chamber, their torches casting long, flickering shadows against the jagged rocks. The growls were now unmistakable, reverberating through the air, vibrating the ground beneath their feet. And then they saw it. A massive, grotesque shape loomed in the darkness, its body undulating, shifting in and out of focus as if it was never truly solid. Tendrils of darkness stretched out from it, as if the very air around it was being warped, distorted. The thing's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed faintly, as though they were not seeing the world around them, but the very depths of their souls. Dr. Hayes's heart skipped a beat. She knew instinctively that this creature was not just a product of the cave. It was the source of the signal from deep within the earth. The creature made no sound as it advanced, but the air around them seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on their chests like a weight. And in that moment, Dr. Hayes realized the awful truth. The earth was calling. It had been calling to them, pulling them in with its signals. But it wasn't the earth itself, no, something far older, far darker, was speaking through it. Something that had been buried deep within the planet's bowels for eons, waiting for the right moment to wake. And now that moment had come. The creature loomed in the chamber, its form shifting and twisting as though it were not fully bound to this world. The air was thick with an unnatural cold, and the very ground seemed to tremble with every movement it made. Dr. Hayes could barely breathe as her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. It was impossible. Nothing in her training had ever prepared her for this. "Stay calm," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising tension. "We need to get out of here." Jacob, Monica, and Ethan stood frozen, eyes wide with terror. Jacob was the first to react, stumbling backward, his legs shaking. "Evelyn, what is that thing?" he choked out. Dr. Hayes could barely form a coherent thought. The creature's presence seemed to erase all rationality. It was not simply a living being, it was something that defied all understanding, an entity older than the planet itself, perhaps even older than time. It was clear to her now, this was the source of the signal, and it had been waiting for them. The thing's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were fixed on them, or at least she thought they were. It was impossible to discern where it was looking, as the creature's gaze seemed to shift and blur with every passing moment. And then, a sound. It wasn't a growl or a screech, but something far more unsettling, a voice. A whisper, though it felt like it was vibrating in her very bones. The words were incomprehensible, a series of guttural sounds that seemed to reverberate through the chamber, pulsing in time with the erratic signals that had drawn them here. "You should not have come." The words echoed in Dr. Hayes's mind, clearer than they had any right to be. She recoiled in horror. The voice wasn't coming from the creature directly, it was coming from the earth itself. The signal, the tremors, the whispers, it had all been a message, a warning. The ground beneath their feet rumbled again, stronger this time. It was as though the planet was alive, its heartbeat quickening as if it were waking up from a long slumber. Dr. Hayes turned to her team, her heart racing. They had to leave now. "We have to go," she shouted. This place is. She was cut off by a sudden, deafening crash, followed by the sound of stone scraping against stone. A fissure opened in the ground before them, yawning wide like the mouth of some ancient beast. The chamber shook violently, and Dr. Hayes felt a wave of dizziness hit her as the ground beneath them seemed to shift. The air grew thicker, colder, pulsing with a malevolent energy. Monica screamed, stumbling backward as the ground split open even further. The creature, the thing that had been lurking in the shadows, seemed to be growing, its form expanding, as if the cave itself were opening up to accommodate it. "We have to move." Dr. Hayes shouted again. "Now." But it was too late. The darkness that surrounded them was alive, pushing in from all sides. The walls seemed to be closing in, and from the depths of the fissure something else began to emerge. Long, writhing tendrils of blackness reached up from the gaping maw in the earth, coiling around the rocks and twisting like snakes. The air was suffocating, thick with the smell of burning earth. Jacob pushed forward, grabbing Dr. Hayes by the arm, his voice frantic. "Evelyn, we can't outrun this. We're not going to make it." "Stay together," she commanded, pulling him back. Her mind was racing, there had to be a way out. They had to get back to the surface. But no matter how hard she tried to focus, the world around them was unraveling. The walls of the cave were warping, shifting, as if they were no longer part of the natural world. The very rock seemed to breathe, pulsing with the rhythm of the creature's heartbeat. Then something worse happened. The signal, the one they had been tracking for weeks, intensified to a deafening roar. It wasn't just a seismic pulse anymore, it was a physical force crashing into them with a violent, disorienting wave. The ground buckled beneath their feet and the cave began to collapse in earnest, rocks tumbling down from the ceiling, blocking every possible exit. Dr. Hayes staggered backward, her vision blurring, but she couldn't stop. She had to keep moving. They had to survive. But in the chaos, she lost sight of her team. "Monica!" Ethan, she screamed, her voice swallowed by the thunderous sound of the collapsing cave. But there was no answer. The darkness had already claimed them. Fear gripped her chest like a vice. Panic surged, but she forced herself to breathe, focusing on the faint glow of her torch. It was dimming. The signal was overpowering everything. Through the shaking, through the deafening roar, she saw it, there, at the far end of the cavern, a faint opening barely big enough for a person to slip through. It was their only hope. Jacob, she cried out, grabbing his arm. We have to go. Now. With a grunt, Jacob pulled himself to his feet. He was pale, his face smeared with dirt and sweat, but there was a fire in his eyes. He nodded, and together they stumbled toward the opening. Just as they reached the fissure, the creature's voice came again. This time it was louder, more insistent. The earth seemed to scream with it, shaking violently as if protesting their escape. You cannot leave. You are mine. The voice was inside her head, crashing through her skull like a wave. Dr. Hayes gasped, her hand flying to her temples as the sound of the signal overwhelmed her senses. She could feel it, the weight of the earth itself pushing down on her. She had to keep moving. Without thinking, she squeezed through the gap, pulling Jacob behind her. The ground was still shaking as they crawled through the narrow opening, the darkness pressing in on them. It felt as though the very rock was alive, squeezing them tighter with every passing second. When they finally emerged into the cold, open air, Dr. Hayes gasped for breath, her chest heaving. The outside world seemed impossibly bright after the suffocating darkness of the cave. She looked around, searching for any sign of her team, but there was nothing. The island was eerily silent, the fog thick and impenetrable. Jacob stood beside her, his eyes wide with fear. What was that thing? He whispered. Dr. Hayes couldn't answer. The signal was still there, ringing in her mind like a persistent, maddening pulse. The earth was still calling, and she knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. The signal would continue, growing stronger, more insistent. And somewhere, deep below, the creature, whatever it was, waited for its moment to rise. They had barely escaped. But the signal, it wasn't just a signal anymore. It was a warning. And it was still coming. Thank you very much and see you all in the next video. Love you guys.